Welcome to another episode of the Soothing Semantics podcast. I'm your host, Rafi Pinsky. Smash the like button. Of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And for all of your real estate needs in South Florida, make sure to give me a call, shoot me a text, a DM. You can follow me at Rafi the Realtor on Instagram. This week, we have a very educated, well-spoken, articulate guest, another Brit. I always love talking to British guests because no matter what you say, it always sounds more eloquent than when I say it. So I always appreciate talking to Brits. Just had Tommy Robinson on recently, and I met Jonathan Sacerdoti at the rally, at the UK rally. Really great to meet you in person. I'm glad we met in person prior to our sit down now. So Jonathan Sacerdoti is a broadcaster, journalist. He has a podcast as well. He has a whole YouTube channel which is called Jonathan Sacerdoti. So check him out on YouTube. You can find him on all major social media platforms. And I've seen your work for quite a few years now, and I really commend you immensely on the speech you gave at Oxford. So I implore everybody after this episode to give it a listen. He dealt with a lot of pressure from the students. They had a lot of things to comment, and he stood his ground and he kept going and in his support for Israel. And I thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thanks
Great
for
to
having
have
me,
you.
Rafi. It's good to be with you and good to see you remotely, having met you in London when you were here not that long ago.
Right. Without it's a pleasure to be here for a proper long conversation because we only spoke briefly. So Jonathan, give us a little bit of a background on your upbringing, what it was like being born and raised in England, what it was like maybe then growing up as a young kid, a teenager, young adult, and seeing how things have played out in the last, 10, 20 years or so.
Sure. Well, I was born here in London and I grew up here and I was educated at Oxford University. My father was actually Italian. He moved here when he married my mother in his late 20s, and his father had been a rabbi in Italy. And my father was a Holocaust survivor. He, as a young child, he was a hidden child, so he wasn't in the camps, but he was saved from being sent to the camps because his father, who was a rabbi, had the whole family split up and hidden. So my father ended up for 2 weeks initially in a convent in Florence. And then, as they were raiding the convents, as the Nazis were raiding the convents, he was evacuated from there to a Catholic orphanage in the countryside nearby in Tuscany, where he spent 9 months at the age of 5 with his younger brother, who was 3, separated from their parents, not knowing if they would once again be reunited afterwards. They were, thank God. But of course, as a 5-year-old, I'm not sure exactly how much of that he would have comprehended either. He just knew that his parents sent him away with this instruction to look after his younger brother, to say the Shema every night in his head silently, and not to let the other children in the orphanage see him naked because they would realize that he was Jewish. And those were his instructions. Thank God they were reunited after the war. My grandfather was also hidden, and my grandmother too. And as a result of that, I think my upbringing as a British Jewish child here was one where I think I was always very aware of the looming threat of anti-Semitism. I think perhaps all Jewish people are, and we all have a story or a connection to the Shoah. On my mother's side, her family had lived here longer. But they too, of course, had connections. And in fact, they were Ashkenazi, so they came from Eastern Europe and Ukraine, well, what is now Ukraine. So even on that side, there is some connections too, though they were here a bit longer, and my mother was born here. So as a result, I grew up very British. That's why I sound like this, and I went to Oxford, and after that went into television production. So I was initially a television producer, and I worked in a series of independent production companies in the sort of heyday of independent TV production here in the UK. And then gradually I shifted and transitioned to being more of a full-time journalist, and have done various different things over the years, but have spent many years now covering Israel and the Middle East, and also anti-Semitism and racism and British politics and terrorism. I've covered many terror attacks around Europe, in Israel, and here in the UK. And so all of these things kind of came together over recent years. And in particular, since October the 7th, there's been a spike in interest in my work, which again has been exhausting in many ways, as it has been for many of us, but also very rewarding, because it's good to be able to communicate to an audience what it is you've got to say from a position of having covered so much of this stuff for so many years. And as a result of that work as well, I often get asked to do things like talks and lectures, and as you mentioned there, that Oxford Union debate, which I was invited to do, a sort of homecoming, let's say, to go back to Oxford and debate Israel. And of course, it was something of a setup. They made sure that we didn't get a very warm welcome there. And as a result of that, I mean, one video of the abuse I was getting there on my Instagram has something like 13 million views, which is somewhat staggering for me to think
Wow.
about. That's an extraordinary number of people who watch me being abused and sworn at.
It's insane. 13 million?
13 million.
A lot of people, I'm sure, were very happy about it. Wow.
Well, I think, you know what, when I think about it, the particular clip in question is one where I kind of answer them and explain to them why it's not the smartest way to conduct yourself in a debate. And actually, I think regardless of the fact that our debate was about Israel, I think what shocked so many people, what piqued people's interest was really that. I think that it seemed to chime with this idea that many believe the younger generation, the kind of generation of students now, don't really understand how to disagree with people without abusing them, or to listen to opinions and points of view that they maybe don't agree with or even might hate, but how to listen to them and take them on board and absorb them. And the whole point of what I do is I always try to be rational and calm and analytical. So for me, it was just a question of laying out the case, and a debate is a formalized context in which you do that. So I really didn't necessarily expect that level of abuse. I expected a robust and colourful debate. And I think when I was met with that, I was quite shocked, and I was speaking alongside some other, very people I very much admire myself, who are speaking alongside me, Mossab Hassan Youssef and Yosef Haddad, and
Hmm.
also Natasha Hausdorff. So these people who are friends of mine, I also respect enormously because of their insight and knowledge, and they were treated also appallingly in that room. I mean, the idea that Mossab Hassan Youssef was threatened to be kicked out by the chairman of the debate at one point was
Hmm.
ridiculous. So yeah, I think the 13 million it's a massive number. It's quite weird for me to think about it sometimes. And I think it's because people were just really shocked at how in what's meant to be, one of the best universities in the world, at a student debating society, which is meant to be the last bastion of free speech, people saw really something quite astoundingly bad. People refusing to listen, refusing to engage, refusing to debate.
Right. It's incredible. I mean, I watched both Musab Hassan Yusuf's speech and Yusuf Haddad's speech. Yusuf Haddad's speech really, really, really hit me.
Yeah,
It was so powerful. His story in the military of how Jews saved him when he was injured, and it,
yeah.
it really shaped his love for Israel, and he's gone out and he's put himself in the line of fire in every sense of the word, both in the military and now on college campuses around the world. People, so many people hate the guy for his proud stance on Israel, and it takes a hell of a lot of guts, really, really does. So I want to kind of now shift these ideas into what's happening now in the UK. As I mentioned in the beginning, I met you at Tommy's rally, and that brought a few million people, from what I understand. The British government was trying to dumb it down and claim that there were maybe 100,000 people, but I believe we know that to be a much higher number. What do you think of the British youth now? You know, now that the war may be coming to an end, things are still wishy-washy with the deal. What do you see happening? What do you see happening with, say, the next, say, let's say 2 to 5 years in regards to safety for Jews and the continuation of Britain as we know it?
The Tommy Robinson March, the Unite the Kingdom rally, was an interesting one. And as you said, that's where we met. I went there to cover it for the Spectator. I write for the Spectator, which is, I think it claims to be the world's oldest magazine. It's certainly a respected and establishment magazine here in the UK. So I'd gone there to write about it because it was obviously a very controversial affair, and Tommy is a very controversial person. And I went just, I suppose, a little bit apprehensive because here it was portrayed as a far right, extremist, racist gathering. And so I went there with some trepidation. But then, of course, what I experienced was far from that. And I think that I wrote about it quite openly, and I wrote how I went there with my husband, who's also my producer for my podcast series, and that we'd gone there to work. We'd gone to collect our press pass early in the morning, and it was due to start around 2 p.m. So we got there at 8 to get our pass. And I'd actually, it sounds a bit silly now, I'd planned to go to synagogue after I picked up my pass. It was on a Saturday morning. So we dressed for synagogue, and then we'd gone to get the press pass. And once we got there, we realized, of course, we can't leave and come back. There's literally no way we'd get back there. The scale of it was so huge. So we decided to stay there. So actually, I hung out there all day as the crowd built and as the various speakers arrived, and that's how we met. And it was astounding. So Amir, my husband, decided he would wear a kippah
I
because
remember that.
he had
It
it in
was
his
great with
pocket.
his
Right.
long, thick, wavy hair.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he had it in his pocket for synagogue. He's like, I'm going to wear this all day. And I thought, oh, please don't do that. But actually good choice, because what happened was, so, if you can imagine it, this gay couple there. He's mixed race, non-white, non-British immigrant, Jewish, visibly Jewish. So I thought, if anything's going to go bad at this racist far-right rally, I'm going to see it. And quite the opposite happened. Like, everybody was extremely just lovely. People were just really very, very nice to us. I experienced a sort of very different gathering than the one I'd been expecting. And there were some bits I wasn't very comfortable with, and I wrote about that as well. But I wrote the whole thing up fairly openly and honestly. And the reaction to that was quite amazing because, for example, I got booked by the BBC to go on The World at One. It's on Radio 4, like their main news and spoken word channel, because they read the article. I think they were quite astounded that people had gone and reasonably, it's not really their style on this topic. And when they called me, I've said it's like they were calling someone who'd been on safari to somewhere exotic to ask me what it was like. And really, all I'd done is go to Whitehall and meet some British people. And that shouldn't be so controversial for the British Broadcasting Corporation. So I was very pleased to describe it to them as well. And then, in fact, I sat down with Tommy and we had a long 2-hour conversation. We just released that on my podcast a few days ago. So it's a really in-depth conversation I had with him where he talked about the march and the rally, the things he did right, the things he did wrong. I asked him a lot of tough questions because I felt that within the Jewish community, there is still a great deal of animosity towards him and fear of him. And so I really wanted to confront all of that. And that's part of what I try to do in the interviews and conversations I have, is I consider it my job to go there, to explore these difficult conversations, and often with difficult people, because I think we all deserve to know what someone is really like in that context. And it's had an extraordinarily positive response, actually, that interview. A lot of people have been getting in touch to say they really respect that I let him speak, but also that I really tested his ideas and challenged him when I needed to. So I'm very pleased that that's gone very well as well as a result of that march. And to your broader question, what's going on here over the next few years? It's very interesting to think about that. It's a very interesting time. There is something of a crisis going on here socially. That rally had many, many people there. So whether it was the 150,000 that the police said, or the 3 million that some of the organizers were saying, I suspect the truth's somewhere in between. But I recognize that there was a massive movement there. And even if you don't like Tommy Robinson and what he stands for, that number of people don't get together for something without really there being a strong feeling underlying it that united them all. And I think that feeling, as I've tried to describe it, was a mixture of things. It was an element of discontent with where the country is, a massive opposition to the vast amount of immigration that's gone on here, specifically illegal immigration, and also what I refer to as unassimilated immigration. So people who move here but have not tried to integrate into British society, or into what we might traditionally have called British society. And many people point back to around 1997, when Tony Blair became the Prime Minister and ushered in this period of multiculturalism, which was to say that we would be a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, but one in which those ethnic and cultural groups didn't have to integrate, didn't have to sort of adopt British culture, British English even, and that you could sort of coexist as parallel but very different cultures in the same country. And I think that there are many people who now feel that experiment went drastically wrong, including some previous prime ministers. David Cameron spoke about it, and I think it's just peaked now, because we still have this vast wave of immigrants coming in, and even the vote to leave the European Union with the Brexit referendum didn't seem to stem the tide. And now we have these issues of small boat immigrants. These are people that get on kind of dinghies and cross the English Channel from France. All of this has contributed to a really strong feeling among parts of British society that we've just tipped over, that we've gone too far, that things might be irreversible now. And then you couple that with certain elements of our modern experience, like terrorist incidents. I mean, we just had on Yom Kippur, just a few days ago, a terrorist attack on a synagogue in Manchester, so the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Jews attacked in a place of worship for being Jewish, presumably. I mean, the suspect who was shot dead was called Jihad. And all of this has made people really concerned. And I think it's completely valid concern. And then at the same time, something I don't know if you noticed at Tommy's march at the rally, there was a strong undercurrent of restoring Christian values and Christian culture to Britain. And that surprised me a little bit, actually, if I'm honest, because I very much respect the Christian foundations of British culture, but it wasn't something I'd expected to hear there as strongly as I did. And it was interesting. And I have to say, in hindsight, I'm actually quite, I get it. I respect that, because I don't find that in and of itself threatening as a non-Christian, as a Jew, because I think we Jews generally have integrated quite well into British society. And also Jewish values and Christian values are very connected, one having come from the other. So I think that this is a phenomenon that we're in the middle of, and it's one that the country is trying to find its way around. And as to what will happen in the next 4 or 5 years, it's a great question. We just elected in this country, a bit over a year ago, a Labour government, a left-wing government, not because I think there was particularly a left-wing swing in public opinion, but because we just had 14 years of Conservative government, or Conservative-led government. And I think it was just a massive disappointment with how they had done. Towards the end, we ended up with 3 prime ministers in quick succession. Nobody had voted for Rishi Sunak or for Liz Truss to be their prime minister. They had voted overwhelmingly for Boris Johnson, but the Conservative Party turned on him, got rid of him, replaced him. And so I think that overall, it was more of a reaction against the right than in favour of the left that we ended up with that government. But that's who we've got now. And so the next 4 years could be very interesting, because we're left with a government that's very unpopular, actually, despite having won a resounding majority. And they seem to be torn between the far left on their side and the right on the other side. And Britain is slowly making its way through this crisis of identity and immigration and general difficulty of living in this country. And so how it will unfold remains to be seen. And just to put a final element on that, we have the right kind of disintegrating or reforming along new lines. So we have a party called Reform UK, which is led by Nigel Farage, who is really the driving force behind the whole Brexit enterprise for Britain to leave the EU. And now he has formed Reform UK, and that seems to be enormously popular in polling at the moment, so much more so than the Conservative Party. So the prospect of a party that didn't exist a few years ago potentially winning another election overwhelmingly compared to, say, the Conservative Party, and we're a country that's been governed by two main parties for a very long time. So all of this is uncharted territory, and it remains to be seen how it does map out, especially with our electoral system not necessarily favouring the fracturing of votes left and right across various or multiple parties. So I don't really know what's going to happen in the coming years, but it is very scary for a lot of people, particularly for Jewish people.
Right. It's it's complicated when you don't feel like the conservative movement or the movement, the Conservative Party or the Democratic Party, neither seem to be making the right and necessary changes. Uh, I'm not so familiar with Boris Johnson's policies, for example. I really don't know much about British politics. It's just very complex when it comes to immigration. Because on one hand, people say, "Oh, well, we need immigration for certain jobs, and maybe the British aren't having enough children." So, these are arguments that have been made. Now, I didn't finish watching the Tommy Robinson episode that you recorded, but I just want to quickly go over some of the things that you pressed him on, being that he does seem to be pro-Israel, but then again, he's very pro-white Englishman, and he wants that to be uh, he wants that to be the picture of England, which is very understandable. So, what are a few of the things you pressed? So,
Yeah. So look, I mean, in terms of that as well, I think there's been a big effort or move to portray him as far right,
mhm.
and I suppose related or linked to that as racist, and violent as well. So I wanted to press him on those things in particular, because I think they're not unfounded. That's the point. I think people are drawing on specifics in his biography to make those allegations. So he has, for example, spent time in jail more than once. He has been in trouble with the law. He has he started his activism, let's say, in his early 20s as a reaction to what he saw going on in Luton, where he grew up, which became very, very, very much more influenced by the rise of Islam in that region, in that area, and extreme Islam. So this is how he got into all this. And Tommy isn't an Oxford graduate. He's a regular working class guy from Luton. So he doesn't express himself in the same way that I might, for example, or another contemporary of mine at Oxford, Douglas Murray. We have different styles, all of us. But I try not to give too much time to the kind of snobbishness that I think has gone into it. So I think there is an element of class dissatisfaction in a lot of the criticism of him, which I just don't think is fair or reasonable or valid, because we all come from different places and we all speak to different audiences and we all speak in different ways. So some of us write, in establishment magazines or broadcast or do podcasts, and others led street movements, and that's what I think Tommy did. But he did start out with the EDL, the English Defence League, which did have problems in the beginning. And the truth is, though, he left his own organisation, and he was quite outspoken at the time when he did. I rewatched a load of the sort of landmark interviews he did over the years, including a very famous one on Newsnight, which is like the main BBC news discussion show in the evenings on television here. It used to be kind of indispensable viewing in the old days, and he was interviewed by Jeremy Paxman, who is a kind of veteran, very well respected, tough interviewer. And when you watch these things back now, you can't help but smile in a weird way because he's talking about things which have become totally mainstream to discuss, but he's being treated at the time as having been a crazy radical Islamophobe. And the
Hmm.
truth is, I think his message has always been quite consistent, which is that he is very critical of Islam, but he's educated himself over the years, as far as one can see, very, very deeply on Islam and read the Quran and studied quite a lot. And I think that his criticisms are valid and worth listening to, even if you don't necessarily agree with them all or necessarily agree with the way he expresses them. So I think that that was part of what we explored in the conversation. I also challenged him on a few of the speakers that I heard at the event because there were a lot of speakers. I think something like 20 or 25 different speakers and performers came on stage. And some of them were a bit much for me, I have to say. There was a guy, I don't know if you remember the guy that led the haka, the Maori dance. And
Yes.
he came on and he gave like a very impassioned speech about how Christianity needed to be restored in the UK, but non-Christian places of worship needed to be banned. So
Hmm.
while he didn't mention synagogues, for example, I obviously, as somebody that attends a synagogue who's Jewish, who isn't Christian, I didn't like the idea of our country banning places of worship.
Hmm.
And yet I do understand that some people have issues with, for example, radical mosques, where there are preachers inside who preach anti-Jewish hatred or other messages which might be completely counter to British culture and even British law. So I think it's an important topic to discuss, but one has to be really careful with how one discusses it. And I didn't feel that that guy had been sufficiently careful. And he also he did that thing where he ripped up flags. He ripped up the PLO flag, the Palestinian flag, and he ripped up an ISIS flag, I think, and then a flag of, I think it was secular humanism. So I understood his outlook and his message, but I think that ripping flags is an extremely provocative act, even if they're
Hmm.
flags that I personally felt it was valid to condemn what they stood for. I understand that that is a very provocative act. And another one that I had some criticism over was Valentina Gomez, who is another speaker
Oh,
there. So I don't know if you know
the
of her
burning,
or know her.
the fire, the lighting the Quran on fire with the flamethrower or whatever it
Right.
was, right?
I mean, exactly. And the thing is that, I spoke to her backstage as well. So I do
Oh.
understand where everyone is coming from. But I think that Valentina, from what I've seen of her, I wasn't aware of her until a few months ago, is somebody who I think is deliberately provocative, but in a
Yeah, I don't
very
take her
provocative way.
I don't take her seriously, and I think it would be destructive for her to be in a high place of government. I think she's entertaining. I think she may even have points that are valid. But I don't think that's conducive. I don't think having her, she's not. The problem with someone like that is she may not like Islam, but she can just as quickly turn on any other group and
Well, so for example, one of the things that
concerns me.
I when I first got sent that video of her, she did this thing where she walked up. I don't know what the event was. It seemed to be like the opening of a mosque or something, or some kind of public event. I assume it was in Texas where she's running, and she
Hmm.
went to the podium dressed, I think, in a hijab, and then ripped it off and gave this kind of speech against Islam and was carted away. And that
Right.
is how I became aware of her. Lots of people were sharing this video, so I did a bit of research about her, and very quickly I found, for example, that she'd said things about being weak and gay and had referred to gay people as faggots and those sorts of things. And
Right.
I can kind of sympathize with a right wing, often seen as right wing agenda to remove like LGBTQ, especially the kind of trans agenda stuff from children's curriculums. And I'm actually very supportive of that sort of sentiment myself, regardless of the fact that I'm gay. But I think you've just got to be very careful how you express yourself. So I don't think it's very helpful to call gay people faggots. It's not that it particularly offends me personally that she did it, but it's clearly designed to be offensive. And
Right.
similarly, when debating issues about Islam that are controversial, difficult, whatever it is, I think there are there are ways that we can do it. And all of that said, what I did understand from Tommy was that he's somebody that hasn't been afraid to be provocative himself over the years. And what I felt that he said was, in relation to his own work and background, that sometimes he's been deliberately provocative in order to get a debate or a conversation going where there wasn't one. So he said that at the beginning of his time in the English Defence League, he deliberately held his protests in places where it would cause friction. So he would go to where the mosques or the Islamic extremists were, and there would be a confrontation on the street. And he said that he doesn't do that anymore because he doesn't need to, because the conversation is now everywhere. But at the time, he said, it wasn't everywhere. And so I understood through that, maybe there are people who believe that provocation can sometimes be the necessary catalyst to getting a conversation going. It's still not my style. And I think that the fear I have is that it can be very dangerous and it can attract people to a cause or another who have really very scary intentions or very bad intentions. And I don't want to appeal to those people for any cause I believe in. I want to appeal to reason and, by all means, being bold and forthright about what one thinks and stands for, but to do it respectfully as well.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think in every group you're going to have your people that believe that things can be solved through dialogue and dialogue only, and then you're going to have people who believe that things need to be solved in a more forceful manner or a physical manner, and then you may have some people that are somewhere in between. I'm in the in between camp, but I would say that it's very situational, and I think that you can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
You have to have
Um,
in every, for example, with Jews, we can't always dialogue our way to peace. This is what I firmly believe it, and I also believe that we can't completely war our way to peace. We have to have the ability to do both, and there's also a time for each one. In a time where war needs to be fought, dialogue is not the thing we should be focusing on.
yeah.
When dialogue is the thing and it's very tough to balance the two. It's incredibly nuanced and incredibly complicated. Uh, for the time being now, my opinion was our war efforts were more important than the dialogue and the media, because we're losing the media war largely because the Muslim world is as big as it is. They're going to support the Palestinians, uh, you know, blindfolded. And I felt that certain war efforts needed to be had. Now,
Well, it's that Kohelet thing, a time for peace, a time for war. There is indeed a time for everything, and I think I would agree with what you just said there in relation to Israel. I think that also the Trump ethos, the Trump sort of doctrine, seems to be peace through strength, and that's very much an Israeli attitude, which is to say, by all means, peace. Of course, Israel wants peace with its neighbors, but it seems that the right way to achieve that peace in a very challenging neighborhood is through strength. And so on October the 7th, there was a massive breach of Israel's security and strength, and it looked very weak for a moment. And it then spent the subsequent 2 years doing everything it can to prove that it is very strong. And as
mhm,
a result of that, yes, there is the possibility of ending war, of creating, I won't say peace, because I don't think there is particularly at the moment, but it's less out of the question than it might have been on October the 8th, 2023.
mhm.
So I see exactly what you're saying, and I suppose I am closer towards the dialogue side of things, but I'm also somebody that is very fascinated by the area in between the two, and that's why, in terms of my work and my interviews and my writing and the podcast, I'm interested to talk even to people who are quite extreme or controversial sometimes, because I think that I will talk to them. I won't necessarily do what they
Right.
do, but I want to understand the phenomenon, and I want to understand what's happening. I want to question it, and I want to test it, and I want to hear what they have to say. And actually, one of the greatest honors for me is when I interview people, sometimes quite well-known people, that they'll turn around at the end, as usually when we've stopped filming, and say, nobody ever asked me that before, or I didn't quite think of it that way before. And that's the ultimate compliment for me, because if that's the end of a
Definitely.
conversation we've had, then that's great, I think.
It's phenomenal. Yeah. I can't wait to listen to the rest of the Tommy episode. You had him in tears, Jonathan. That shows you have an incredible knack for deep conversation, the ability to bring the deepest emotions in people. Because I haven't seen, maybe he has, but I haven't seen a podcast where Tommy cried.
You know, I
So
told you I started out as a TV producer. So back then I used to work in for some of that time in entertainment TV, and you know when we were doing like audition reels and what have you for things that shows were making or whatever, sometimes we would want to get a certain reaction out of people. So I can't lie, I think at the moment that that happened, I did think, wow, that's quite an epic part of this interview because I hadn't expected that. And I did remember a silly story for you. Like there was one producer I used to work with, and I was quite junior, and he was like, "If we just bring an onion with, and someone can just chop this up behind the camera while you're doing it, then we might get a tear or two." But I promise we didn't do that with Tommy. Uh,
and I went to the butterfly field and it was just so beautiful.
exactly.
And he's like, "Why am I crying? It was nice, but it was." And the guy's just like chopping up the onions, you
Exactly.
know.
So, no, but I mean, in all honesty, that was another thing that really surprised me about him. Is I said it to him quite early on. I said, you actually strike me as quite an emotional guy. You're quite in touch with your emotions, and I've seen you speak
Mhm.
and get quite emotional about stuff, especially this topic, because I think it really comes from deep inside him, his passion for all
Mhm.
this stuff. And you know, say what you will about him, like even if you really hate him and hate what he does. I don't think one can question that he must genuinely have some kind of dedication and drive beyond that of most regular people because he's willing to go to jail for it multiple times. He's willing to literally break the law in certain occasions. He knows when he is breaking the law. He knows when he's going to court what the potential consequences are. And the guy's still doing it. It hasn't stopped him.
Mhm.
So even if you completely disagree with him and you completely disagree with him breaking the law, you have to at least give him acknowledgement that he must feel pretty driven and passionate about it. And that's why I recognize that that comes from a place of deep emotion, I would say, in some cases. And other people will say that is a further flaw in his personality, they might say. So, yeah, I think it was a really, really interesting conversation for me anyway. And I'm very pleased that other people seem to find it interesting as well. So I do recommend it. It's a long one at 2 hours. But I just felt the conversation was so interesting, we should let it run as long as it took.
Fair. It's a valid point. Like I said, I'm looking forward to listening to it. So before I bring up the hostage deal, I do want to continue on with Tommy a little. Now, what I'm thinking, where my intuition is leading me, is that unless the overall Muslim population in England helps to combat the grooming gangs and the lack of assimilation and you know the worries that the native Brits have, especially if the population shifts more towards a Muslim population instead of it being, I think, what is it, 6% now?
I don't know the exact number actually, and I also think it's quite hard to measure precisely. But
Right,
yeah.
right, right. So if it becomes 30, 40% or 50, if things don't change, if they continue down this trajectory, something bad is going to happen because it's already becoming very difficult. It's already becoming very problematic. So something has to be changed. Something needs to happen. And so the only fear I have, I'm not British, but I am Jewish, is that if the problem persists and gets worse, then naturally the British will either go two ways. They will either become so mentally exhausted that they'll just let themselves be, kind of taken over in a way, or they'll become a lot more right wing and will seek to expel or just literally go to war with the immigrants. And so that could spill over into the Jewish side of things, where you have so many right wingers that go, you know what, it's not just the Muslims, it's everybody. Because we've seen this in history many, many, many times.
So I don't think I have trouble with this kind of like everyone will get very far right or extreme right attitude,
Mhm.
and I also hear from a lot of Jewish people this fear that if one aligns oneself with some of the forces who are against, let's say, Islamist extremism,
Mhm.
then you run the risk of aligning yourself with people who are against Jews or Judaism or might be afterwards or one day. And so I've thought about that quite a lot because nobody wants that. But I also recognize that we're a very insignificant number of people in the UK, Jews. Like, so if the Muslim population is around 6.5% in I think in the last census or in the 2021 census, Jews are less than 0.5% in this country. But above all else, I don't think this is a Jewish issue. This isn't just about Jews. In fact, the problems that we have as Jews in the UK are actually symptomatic of something much bigger, which is a kind of challenge or undermining or destruction of something far more fundamental. Our Western liberal values, or what you often hear called Judeo-Christian values, or any of these things, and they sound very stuffy and old-fashioned, and yes, conservative with a small or big C, and right-wing and what have you. But ultimately, they are part of our background and culture. And I think they've been replaced over the years. In fact, over my lifetime, I'm kind of a child of that era with this, I would say, woollier idea of tolerance. And tolerance in and of itself it's a tricky one, because of course we want to be tolerant of other people and other cultures and other things. But where those other cultures are not tolerant of us or of each other, I think we need to have more of an intolerance towards them. And so if they're incompatible with how we are, and again, you said things like native Brits or things like that. And I have trouble even with that, with the idea of indigeneity in Britain. Not that I have anything against people who are, for generations and generations and generations British. Of course I don't. But I'm not one of those people. And I don't think my place here should be in question, insofar as I was born here and brought up here, like many, second or third generation immigrants. I feel very British because I am very British, because not because I have a passport, but because I was born here and I grew up in British schooling and British universities around British people and British culture. So my own concern isn't really about what color your skin is, or what religion you are, or where your family background is from. It's about how you integrate, adapt, respect the place we're in. And I think that, broadly speaking, it's a generalization, but broadly speaking, some immigrant communities or populations to this country have been very successsul. They've integrated well, whilst often keeping something of their original or other culture. So Jews are a good example. Like, we have Jewish culture, we do Jewish things. I'm sure as a Jewish Briton, I am somewhat different to other Britons, but I also have an awful lot in common with them, and I respect even our differences enormously, and I respect my position as a minority and how my culture fits in with others around me. So I think that the problem is when there is a culture that clashes, and I think that sometimes there is this fear that some people will say extreme Islam or Islamist, meaning political Islam, and others will say it's all of Islam, but they feel that in that culture there is more of a tension not to integrate fully, not to assimilate, not to give up something of Islamic culture in the British context. Now, that's an open debate, and that's a very live debate. So I wouldn't want to reduce it down to, we need more or fewer Muslims, or anything as prescriptive or kind of simplistic as that. I don't think that's the answer. But I do think that when it comes to what's wrong, it's easier to spot. So when you can see videos from mosques in the UK where the imams have given a Friday sermon that's been filmed, put out for people to see, that's full of anti-Semitism, full of Jew hatred, preaching against Jews, that's simple. That should be, I think it is illegal, and it should be prosecuted, and it isn't. That's the point. So when we've seen people write things at times of social tension online, say Lucy Connolly, the famous case, she's a British woman who wrote on X that she didn't care if people burnt down the mosques, burned down the mosques for all I care, as she was saying, during a period of kind of rioting. She took it down a few hours later, but she was put in jail eventually for that. And at the same time, there were people inside mosques, preachers, who said far worse, and they weren't put in jail. So to me, it's really about applying the laws that we have and tightening the laws that we have, and just an element of, I hesitate to say common sense because everyone's idea of what's common sense differs, but an element of common sense about certain things that are clearly damaging. So again,
Mhm.
we've had so many mass and quite aggressive anti-Israel protests over the last 2 years, like so frequent that I probably could have tolerated a few and understood them. But when they became such a regular occurrence and they grew in size and they basically made life very difficult for Jewish people and plenty of other people who just found them intimidating or scary or threatening, I think it's obvious that there's a problem when that happens, as much as I think it's obvious if there's an environmentalist protest every other week for months on end, where they glue themselves to trucks and the road and try and shut down airports. Those things are obviously bullying and intimidation, not some kind of God-given right that you have in a democracy to get in everyone else's way, to make other people feel threatened. So I think it's more down to that. I'm sorry if that's a sort of long and non-specific answer, but I think that to me is obviously a problem. So there are plenty of Muslim people in the UK who don't, have a bad word to say about Jews, who aren't supportive of terrorism, who hate Hamas
Mhm.
and hate what happened from the Palestinians on October the 7th, etc., etc. And we can argue till the cows come home about whether they are truly Muslim or whether they're truly fulfilling the words of the Quran. I've had those conversations with people like Mossab Hassan Youssef in the conversation I had with him on my podcast. And,
Mhm.
and, and with Yasmin Mohammed and Sheikh Paul Salahuddin Armstrong. And, I've spoken to plenty of
That's a
Muslims.
name, Salahuddin
Yeah, well,
Armstrong.
sure, Paul
Convert, yeah.
Salahuddin Armstrong. Like, look up that episode. He grew up as a white British Church of England non-observant guy who, in his, I think, around the age of 20, read the Quran and fell in love with Islam, and now is an imam here, with a sort of preaching a kind of moderate Islam. So we had a fascinating conversation. My point is, I'm really up for talking to people. As you can hear, I like to talk. So in my podcast, I like to listen. And I think we just need to talk about all this stuff. And I think we need to trust British people, trust populations that they have common sense, they have a brain. If we open the conversations, we can all of us kind of get to grips with the problems. The biggest thing that's gone wrong, I think, is this forbidding of conversations, this forbidding of expression of controversial views. The idea that certain views are beyond reproach. You can't say that. You can't say this. You can't criticize those people. I think you must. I think we must talk about it. And through talking about it, I hope we can get somewhere.
Tremendous. No, tremendous. You're 100% right. My feeling is that Islam as a religion is not conducive to Western society. What can work is if the populace chooses to follow a more moderate form. But as you know, with abrogation, the religion itself has not reformed like Christianity and Judaism. It's not like Christianity and Judaism don't have violent components. We know they do. But the majority of Muslims and Christians in today's world look at the violent components and say, we understand they exist. We're choosing a different way. And I think this is very much the case. And there are Muslims who have chosen the peaceful path. They've said, there are wonderful components of Islam that are peaceful, that are accepting, that are welcoming. That's what we're about.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm not a theologian. I obviously do deal with a lot of these issues in my work, as I'm sure you do. And my knowledge of Islam, like I always say it, I don't mean it rudely, but I'm not really that interested in Islam per se. I never really
Mhm.
wanted to know a lot about Islam. It's not my faith, it's not my religion. I'm very pleased with mine. But I kind
Mhm.
of got to know it more, and I feel like I had to know more. I read the Quran because I was so curious about the faith that had entered my life, um, in a very negative way. Like, I sometimes talk about, I ask some of my in some of my interviews, I ask people, like, when did you first become aware of Islam? When were you first aware that it existed? And I mean, when did you first become aware of Islam? Let's try that.
When did I first become aware of it? Aware of it in what sense?
Just
Aware
that
that
it
it
existed.
existed?
Like, when did you? You're
Oh,
Jewish, like me. I'm a
as a
Jew. I can tell
as a
you when mine
kid.
was. I mean,
Oh, I mean, as
I
a kid. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, my grandmother, I have Israeli family. My grandmother used to talk to me about it. So, I mean, I knew about it probably in my probably 11 years old, maybe a little later. I mean, I was at least told about it. I mean, I didn't have a good understanding whatsoever. I was a kid, so I just listened to what I was told,
yeah.
which wasn't favorable, which weren't
And
really
where
good
is your
things.
grandmother from?
Well, she was born in the United States, but she's Ashkenazi. Her family's from,
Hmm.
her family's
Okay.
Poland.
So I think it's an interesting question sometimes because I can tell you that I thought really hard. Like I don't know if it's the first time I became aware of Islam, but the first time I can remember being aware of Islam, my father, my late father, was a publisher and a bookseller. And I remember that when Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses, there was the fatwa issued against him for the book, which I think was, seen as blasphemous.
Hmm.
And they were burning the books, and he lived under close police protection for decades, and then eventually they actually caught up with him, and now he's blind in one eye because they stabbed him at a book event only a few years ago in New York, I think it was, in the States somewhere. Now, I was a child, yeah, I was preteen, I think, um, when that happened, when the controversy erupted over that book. And my father, as a bookseller, wanted to sell the book and came up with this idea that he would sell it, but you'd have to ask for it and you'd get it from behind the desk, right? It wouldn't be on display.
Oh, wow, I was like
And
that. Okay.
right, and I remember that it was in the news. There were crowds of people on the street burning this book. Book burning is kind of a big deal, whether it's Valentina Gomez and the Quran or whether it's aggressive Islamic violence burning the Satanic Verses in the streets of London. It's something you remember as a kid, and so that's when I first actively remember really knowing about a thing called Islam. Now, that's a very negative introduction to something for me. And, I don't think
Hmm.
I went and studied it as a child. But later on in my life, when I decided to read the Quran, it was out of a degree of curiosity. But again, it's to a backdrop of key moments in my life, like 9/11. I was 21 years old when that happened. And various Islamic inspired terrorist attacks that I witnessed growing up in Israel. I lived here. I didn't grow up in Israel, but I was always aware of Israel and have family there and used to go there relatively regularly. So I was very aware of the first and second intifadas. And all of these things, I think, for me, piqued an interest in understanding more about Islam. So I do now have an interest. It did come, I'm afraid, from a very negative place. So while Sheikh Paul told me he was given a copy of the Quran by a street preacher hoping to convert him, and he read it and he connected with it in a
Hmm.
beautiful way, I had a very different experience. Yeah, so I don't know what the answer is for Islam. I wouldn't try to tell them, anyone, how to practice their faith or live their life. But I just know that when it has something to say about me and my life and my people, and when it, in its extremist forms, aims to kill me,
Hmm.
Jews, non-Muslims, Brits, Westerners, Europeans, little girls in pop concerts, commuters in trains, all of those were connected to Islam. Does that mean that all Islam is like that? I guess it doesn't. And does it mean all Muslims are like that? Certainly it doesn't. But regardless, it is a very persistent and very clear problem and threat when it manifests in that way, which it does very frequently across the world. And so to me, I will be delighted if I'm no longer afraid of that element or strain or version of an ideology. But I'm afraid we're not there. And I think that, as I said, it's not my place to try and reform a religion, certainly one that isn't mine. And there are some very courageous and impressive people who I know who are doing that within Islam, and I wish them Godspeed. I wish them great strength and protection and security and luck doing it. But I also recognize that they're often higher up on the target list than Jews and Westerners for doing so. And
Yep.
yeah, and so I don't know what the chances are. If it were a financial investment and you're asking me to put all my money on it, I'm not sure I would.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't sound so great. And truthfully, I agree with you. I think, like I said, I think it can be a beautiful thing. It's just as long as it's acceptable, meaning as long as it accepts the other ways of life, it can't impede on the values of another country. If Islam is in Saudi Arabia, fantastic. It's the ruling body, the ruling religion, c'est la vie. They dictate what happens. But in England, if it doesn't respect the laws of the land truly, the culture, the language, the all of it, then it has no place. And I think that that goes for any religion. Jews have to respect a country that they don't technically have rule over. So that to pivot now to a similar but slightly different discussion. You have a lot of anti-Semites that blame Jewish people for having a lot of influence in instituting highly liberal laws. So for instance, a lot of anti-Semites will point to Hitler's distaste with Jewish influence in, uh, say, the sexual freedoms that maybe existed in Germany and maybe that exist in the United States or in Europe now. Liberal Jews that supposedly were the spearheaders, if that's a word. Your linguistics are better than mine. They spearheaded, the trans movement supposedly. Now, I personally didn't do enough research on Jewish influence on, certain freedoms that maybe are not parallel with, say, religious conservative values. But not anti-Semites will blame us for anything in every spectrum. But if there are, say, these trans ideas in schools now where 3-year-olds are getting sex changes, I think that's incredibly destructive. This is an understatement. I think anyone who pushes that idea should be sitting in prison. Now, if I'm just trying to, like, bring this point home. In England, are there because these ideas, I believe, do exist in England, are there Jewish people that play a role in that? Like, because I know you have this guy in the Green Party. He's missing a couple of
Oh
teeth.
yeah, yeah.
You
He
know,
has very British teeth. It's true.
he's very
I
British.
Yeah, he's
This is
Jewish.
listen. This is a tough Jonathan. This is a
Yeah,
tough conversation, but I think it's very important because just like any other group, we also need to internalize certain things. And
yeah. Except here's the
eh,
thing. Here's what I'll
uh,
say. So, for example, I'm not sure what he has to say is a result of him being Jewish. Um, and that this is the point. Of course, you can find Jews who've done dreadful things. There are Jews very famously who've done bad things. I mean, look at Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein, for want of two others, or Bernie Madoff. There are Jews who've done crimes, who've done dreadful things, who've acted immorally. We're human beings like everyone else. Do I think that those people did what they did because they're Jewish or because of Jewish teachings or Jewish preaching? Not really. Certainly not any version of Judaism I'm familiar with, and it's certainly not a mainstream version of Judaism. And do I think that Jewish run states or nations, of which there is only one, act according to Jewish law in an immoral or reprehensible way? I don't think so. Now, some people will, by the way, disagree with that one. I recognize that, but I think they're wrong. And I'm perfectly able to have a rigorous debate with them about that.
mhm,
So, do I think there are Islamic majority states or nations which are run far more according to Islamic law, and that is the root cause of some of the worst features of those places? Yeah, I don't think it's that controversial to say I do think that.
mhm.
So I think there's a distinction between bad Jews and Judaism being bad. And That will apply to every other religion as well. But where there is an actual ideological or doctrinal root cause in an ideology for a behavior that then translates to frequent problems in our society, then I think, of course, we should examine it closely. And so, this is the point. When I've spoken in my work with Muslims, current Muslims, practicing Muslims, reforming Muslims, ex-Muslims, who have things to say on these topics, pretty much across the board, if I ask them, were the 9/11 terrorists Muslim, they'll say yes. And even if
Hmm.
you're a reforming Muslim, like I don't know if you know Dr. Kanta Ahmed, who I interviewed. She's an amazing woman. She's based in New York. She's a medical doctor, but also an observant Muslim herself. But she's very, very much a defender of Israel. She is a defender against anti-Semitism of Jewish people. She's a truly wonderful and extremely intelligent woman, again, who I'm honored to call a friend.
Hmm.
But when I ask her, when you talk about Islamism, Islamists, I get your distinction, but are those people Muslims? And she says, yeah, they are. I can't tell you they're not Muslims. She said, not Muslims how I do it. It's not how I was brought up. I think they are misrepresenting the religion and the Quran. But I don't want to put words in her mouth. But you can hear the words she said to me. It's another one of my interviews on YouTube. But the point is, those people who do kill and say they do it in the name of Islam are not insignificant in number. The attacks are not insignificant, and so I don't think the same is true of Jews personally. And
I
that's just a fact.
just what I was actually getting at was I think many of the extremist Muslims here, it's the opposite. The extremist Muslims are actually following Islam at face value, where the moderates are choosing to not follow it at face value, whereas Jews who are on the extreme left, who are pushing woke agenda, who are incredibly, even sometimes violent on the pro-Palestinian side. They're just incredibly, anti-Israel, pro-Palestine. They're very much not following Jewish values and Torah
Yeah.
ideas. That's what. So
So,
what I'm.
so I
That's.
guess where I think that's taking my mind anyway. It
Uh,
may not be what you're thinking of, but so I think there is. I see it as a kind of American Jewishness, and I hope that doesn't sound dismissive because it's
no, no,
not
no.
meant to be.
Please, do not be,
I,
do
th-
not be, please don't be, do not be politically correct. I
I
beg you.
think that I think that for me as a British Jew who watches from afar, there to put it this way, Israeli Jews, British Jews, American Jews, we're all a bit different in generalized terms in our ethos and our practice even of Judaism. So you go to synagogue, for example, in each of those places, and it looks quite different actually, and. That's interesting. Like I know that the synagogue I go to here, the Spanish and Portuguese, it's the oldest community in the UK. They were the first Jews after the readmission. It's a Western Sephardi community, but like we've been in this country long enough that kind of our services to some people looks a bit. I don't think it's churchy, but it has more of an element of Britishness, and some of the
Mhm.
music is more inspired by a kind of uh, that kind of music. Well, choir sings that kind of stuff, and so that's just cultural. But I think that it reflects that as a religion and a people who've lived in various diaspora communities for a long time. Maybe it's related to what we were talking about earlier. A degree of assimilation and adaptation is inevitable. In fact, it's kind of desirable for the good
Mhm.
of society. And it's also part of our ethos, as I've understood it, that, that as Jews, we respect the law of where we are very much. And we don't see our obligation is to just only obey our laws when we are not, in a place that's governed by those laws. So I think that where am I going with this? It's just to say that so when I talk about American Jewishness, there is a strain I've seen of American liberal Jewishness, which I think you're talking about, where people have often said things like tikkun olam is the be all and end all, and that means being pro-immigration, pro-refugee, pro-gay rights, and this idea of tikkun olam being basically effectively Democrat political policy. I'm not sure that is actually Jewishness or based on Jewish values. You've just said you think it's kind of acting against them, if I've understood you correctly. I would say,
I want to. I have a. I will rant my ass off about this kind of thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, well, so, I mean, by all means do, because I guess I'm just sort of exploring around it. It's not per se one of my areas that I talk on a lot, but just to say that I'm not saying what anyone else should think, but I just think that even when we as individuals have opinions, when we say that, and this is because I'm a Jew, it's the kind of like, as a Jew, I am against X,
Oh
Y, Z.
my
It's like,
God.
okay, but I suppose maybe I say it myself, and so you accuse me of hypocrisy because my as a Jewness might be opposite of what someone else's as a Jewness is. But at the end of the day, the Torah, the Talmud, Jewish teachings, the Chachamim, they do teach something and have done traditionally over the years. That has varied a bit according to, new movements: Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Liberal Judaism, American Judaism, British Judaism, even Sephardi Judaism versus Ashkenazi Judaism, Mizrahi Judaism. Like, we all do have differences in how we study and learn and interpret, and that in itself is quite Jewish. But
Hmm.
I think when a Jew or some Jews do dreadful things, it doesn't have to be related to them being Jewish, even if they think it does. That's what I think I'm saying.
Here's my psychology on it, and listen, I'm a third. I've said this many times on my show, but what I've learned is that I have a pretty solid intuition. And when I was younger, I would second guess my intuition more than I should have, and then I realized that I was oftentimes more correct than I thought I was, and I've learned to trust my intuition a little more. And my feeling is that and again, no political correctness out the window right now. I've said this many times on my show. I think that there's a propensity more for Jews, many Jews of Ashkenazi background, and I say this as an Ashkenazi Jew, where they tend to adopt very liberal ways of thinking, very pacifist ways of thinking, dialogue, conversation. Violence is never good, it's never the answer. And so, no matter what circumstance they're in, no matter what predicament they're in, no matter who their enemies are, no matter any sort of altercation or a confrontation. And so they're willing to throw themselves under the bus, their own people under the bus. They'll respectfully, if somebody that isn't Jewish doesn't like their way of thinking or doesn't like who they are, they're going to automatically look inward and say, "Well, I have to change myself because other people don't like who I am." Versus, "Well, maybe you just don't like who I am, and that's your fucking problem." Excuse my French. And so I think that's very destructive because if you don't, from an individualistic level, if you don't have a sense of identity and in some circumstances you're willing to give people the finger, then they're able to sway you in every possible direction and say, "Well, we're going to take you in this direction. We hate you for it. Oh, well, so maybe we'll move in the other direction. Nah, I hate you for that. I hate you when you do that too. Oh, well, we could always do this. We could try that. Nah, we hate you anyway. So when do you like me? I don't." And this is, I think, a large part of and I say I don't mean to I don't like to just say liberal conservative, right? There's more nuance than that. But the hardcore woke, the really strong hardline, progressive, there's no backbone to it. And the way they're just able, they'll just go on social media like the Dave Smiths, the Norman Finkelsteins, and many others, and they're just they're going to war with their own people. The way they smear Israel, where it's crazy. I don't blame them for criticizing Israel, criticizing the government. I do it. We should all we should all do it. But the way they completely self-sacrifice, they throw their entire people under the bus.
Look, I mean, I suppose if I'm trying to put myself in other people's shoes, if I
Hmm.
felt genuinely and passionately that my own people or people who operate under the same banner as me or what have you were doing something horrific, I do think I would speak out about it quite passionately myself.
Hmm.
And so if I'm to give those people, you mentioned the benefit of the doubt that that is what they believe, then I can't necessarily blame them for being outspoken about it. But I can
Hmm.
argue with them. I mean, if I think they're wrong, and I do often question my own views in case they're tribal, because the last thing I want to do is think a certain way on a contentious or difficult issue just because I'm tribally connected to people that think a certain way. In fact, my natural
Hmm.
instinct is I'm quite a contrarian at heart. So I'm not sure that's the case. But, I get accused of that. I get accused of being a defender of Israel's actions because I'm Jewish, for example.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
maybe my background as being Jewish means that I have an interest in that area and that I've learnt and studied and what have you a lot more about it than I would have done if I weren't Jewish. And similarly, maybe my outlook culturally and philosophically is a certain way because I was brought up, in a Jewish British way. So that might have an influence as well. But ultimately, I think that I take the positions I do out of a belief that they're correct and out of a desire to kind of pursue a truth and to then spread that and explain it to other people where I think it's important to do so. And then to respect them if they don't agree, by the way. If
Right,
I
right.
feel they don't agree in a valid way that interprets facts and what have you. So that's kind of the bedrock of one's work as an analyst or as a commentator. Um, and part of journalistic integrity is trying to be accurate and trying to test ideas and facts to make sure they're robust and valid. So I think all of that applies as much to me as it does to people who disagree with me. Um, so I kind of respect other people's right to say things that I think are drastically wrong, but I will
Hmm.
criticize them deeply if I think they're um, prejudiced, aggressive, biased, dangerous, and when you have Jewish people saying things that to many Jews or some Jews feel aggressive or self defeating or whatever it is, yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know if I can always say it's because I feel they're trying to sacrifice their people for their own safety or forgiveness or recognition or what have you. Sometimes it might be that. Sometimes I think they're just that's how they feel, and they're just wrong, maybe.
I love how accepting you are. I think that the majority of the time it is that. I will acknowledge that uh, a component of why I think the way I think is due to tribalism. I think the reason why most of the Muslim world supports the Palestinians is due to tribalism. The reason why most Jews are pro-Israel is because of tribalism. Most people on both sides don't have a very
Right,
deep.
but I
Yeah.
suppose what I'm trying to say is like
Mhm.
if my intention, if I enter say an Oxford Union debating chamber with a lot of Muslim people in it, and I want them to
Mhm.
listen to what I've got to say, contrary to what they might have been primed to think by some
Mhm.
other influence in their life before that moment I'm speaking to them, then I have to accept that the same should be true of me. That if somebody comes to me and conclusively proves or lays enough doubt in my mind that the position I've been taking is just wrong, or that there
Mhm.
are too many facts counter to what I think, then I do think I would, even if I was sad about it, accept it. And it's just that I don't think that's happened. So when it's come to things like allegations of genocide, for example. So I of course I wanted to look at that robustly, and I think for all the reasons that have been much discussed, we don't need to go into all the details here and now. I'm sure you've discussed them, I've discussed them, and many greater minds than mine have discussed them publicly. But I just don't think that there is any evidence of that, and I think that the evidence that's been produced is tendentious and deliberately twisted to try to misinterpret a very complex and quite horrible situation as something totally different. So if I want to be able to persuade other people, which I do sometimes, I want them to understand that I'm also open to persuasion. And to take some heat off this, I'll give you a different example. I mentioned earlier the Brexit vote that consumed the United Kingdom for some years. So we were given a referendum, which doesn't happen very often here. Every single person could vote for whether we should leave the European Union. And the vote we were given was leave or remain.
Mhm.
And if you had an instinct, like I had an early instinct when the debate started that I wanted to leave, and that was the kind of opinion that got you labeled as racist and stupid and narrow-minded and far right, any of those things. And so I had the instinct that I had my reasons, but I did say it became this kind of topic that people would debate everywhere in British life. You could debate it with strangers in the gym or at a bus stop or in the pub or in a coffee shop or at school or in your synagogue or your church or with your neighbors. It was a very, very discussed topic. It was on TV, on every kind of program. And I loved that. I'm quite a politically minded person. So for me, it was this extraordinary moment when the whole country was talking politics. And I relished the opportunity to hear why I was wrong. I invited everyone who told me I was a racist moron to explain it to me. Because if I felt like they were right, I would change my mind before
Mhm.
voting day. They didn't change my mind. Like every single conversation I had about it went further to convince me that I wasn't wrong. And
Right.
in the end, I voted how I voted, but I was so open to being wrong. In fact, it would have been so much easier if I had changed my mind, because that would have put me in this group of acceptability among my peers, among the majority of more liberal journalists, among the majority, maybe even of just people I was at university with. Like generally speaking, my life would have been a lot easier if I had agreed with them. So I don't
Mhm.
think it was any. I really think I assessed what I was told and what I saw and watched all the debates and took part in everything and came down on the side I did. And I like to think that the same is true even of things where I might be accused of having a tribal loyalty. So, if the more you tell me my idea is wrong, or I have it only because I'm being slavish to something or loyal out of tribalism, internally, I know the more I will examine it. And
Mhm.
I do stand by that. I think that's why I say, I have done a lot of things that people have said are defending Israel's actions or defending Israel. But for me, they're as much about defending what I see to be true. And that
Mhm.
is very important to me.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah, I've had debates. I've listened to a lot of dissenting opinions. Dissenting opinions in the Jewish world. Obviously, people on the pro-Palestinian side. I've, like I said, I've conducted debates. I've watched countless interviews, and I've really tried to look internally and question my own ways of thinking. The reason I say tribal is because, to me, for instance, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a religious conflict. It's truthfully it's a Muslim Jewish conflict. And so, being that I'm Jewish, being that I identify as a Jewish person, identify as a Jew, being that I am a Jewish person, I very much feel that this is the tribe I identify with now. If to your point, if there were terrible things happening, I would say they're bad. If Jews in the West Bank do something terrible to an Arab family, yes, I condemn that. At the same time, being that I'm a Jewish person, I look at the religious and ethnic connection of Jews. I look at the fact that we won the wars, and to me, above all else, we're here now, right? And so, like I said, I've covered this for years on my show, and I had a point that I was trying to bring home. Um, uh, okay, with the liberal Jewish side, but what I was trying to say is I can totally respect a Jewish person that feels that what Israel has been doing the last 2 years is a genocide. If that's what they believe, they're entitled to that opinion. I just think that to a large extent, it's a fear from what the world thinks versus looking at, for example, what happens around the world in Africa and the Middle East, to what Arabs do to each other, and what, well, like I said, what's happening in Africa. I don't hear any mention from Dave Smith about those things. They don't talk about them.
Right.
They don't
I
talk about
mean,
any of those things.
so I guess um, I would say that I completely get what you're saying there, and I think that for me, um, of course, I feel very connected to the Jewish people and to Jewish peoplehood. And I think that we exist in a long continuum of history. And, part of belonging to a faith and a people like Jews is that you know that you are kind of a thread in a long tapestry that maps through generations and time. So I am aware of that element of my identity. However, I think, for example, when you talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict,
Mhm.
just because of that doesn't mean I couldn't imagine a world in which there could be a peaceful and thriving state of Israel alongside a peaceful and thriving Palestinian state. The problem I have with that is I've never seen any evidence of a mainstream Palestinian political movement that is pursuing that end. And
They never will. They never
right,
will.
but
No.
so my point is that it's not my opposition to Palestinianism isn't tribal because I'm a Jew and they are predominantly Muslim. It is that they are not pursuing something that I see as compatible with the continued existence of a Jewish state or Jews. So if that's the case, it's not tribal. It's just based on facts and like logic, which is to say you cannot expect if I were a non-Jew, I would also feel that way. I would say you can't expect to set up a state alongside another state when your intention is to wipe them out. So I don't think that Israel or is Israel's intention is to wipe out Palestinians. I don't think Israel's intention is to wipe out Islam. I don't think Judaism's intention is to wipe out Islam or to convert the world to Judaism. In fact, quite the opposite. Judaism does not want new recruits. It actively discourages conversion. And Islam actively wants conversion to Islam and wants to replace effectively Judaism, the people of the book, as mentioned in Islam. And so, by definition, tribalism to Judaism doesn't imply opposition to Islam. Only when Islam or any other force is trying to destroy Jews does
Mhm.
that identity make you stand up against it. So it is not something that's what I'm trying to say. I don't think it's tribal. I think it's survival. And when it comes to survival or just justice, that's what I keep saying. If I were not Jewish, it's hard for me to know, but if I were not Jewish, I think I would look at it the same way. And that would be because I would identify that it's an impossibility. It's not about whether I would like it to be. That's what's so weird for me about my own country, Britain's take on recognition of Palestinian statehood. It's a slightly different tack, but just to say, wanting there to be a Palestinian state that lives peacefully alongside Israel, where both sides have security and both sides thrive economically and what have you, is not the same thing as thinking that is possible. And so just saying it doesn't mean it will ever be. And sometimes just saying it in the middle of a 2-year war started by one side when it genocidally invaded the other side and tried to kill and did kill and rape and kidnap is not helpful in my mind. So whereas our government here said, no, it is helpful because what was happening was it looked like that possibility would slide out of view forever. So by saying it now, we're going to make sure it doesn't. Well, it doesn't make it any more likely. It makes it more unlikely because you've effectively encouraged that political movement in its most aggressive moment. You've encouraged it with some form of symbolic reward towards what it says is its aim. So that's what I'm trying to say. I don't think that it's tribal. I think that it's just being open-eyed to reality, even when it's not what you want to be true.
Well, the reason I say it's tribal is because if I wasn't Jewish, I might say, you know what? I don't care who takes it. Let the Palestinians win already so we can be done with this.
See,
So I don't know.
I wouldn't say that. I just wouldn't. I don't believe I would say that. The same as I'm able to look at other injustices in the world, and I mean, maybe I don't know about some of them enough, and that's my bad. But those that I do, I look at them, and I may have no skin in that game, but I will look at them and say that is drastically wrong. Or I can look at the plight of Christians in parts of the world where they're being persecuted, and I'm not a Christian, but I can be disgusted by it and exasperated by it. Or I can look at the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China and be horrified by that, even if I don't like the underlying ethos of Islam in general. So my point is just to say that it doesn't have to be tribal, and I'm not sure yours would be. I don't know you well enough, but I bet there are injustices in the world that have nothing to do with you and your people that you are motivated to speak out
Yeah,
on.
no, for sure. But I still, the reason why the focus of my channel is so much about Israel and not, let's say, what's happening in Sudan is because I'm not Sudanese. So I think that a large, uh,
Yeah,
portion of my life is spent advocating for Israel. If I was Sudanese, I probably would be focusing a lot less on Israel. So you know,
yeah.
that's just my take. And
Well, no, I think so. In
I'm
that case,
personally.
I hear you. That is that. So I always present that not as tribal, but saying I know a lot about this because it kind of affects my life. So I've covered it a lot out of an interest and also just
Tribalism's not so bad, Jonathan. It's okay.
yeah, no.
I
As a
mean, that's
member
my
of this
take.
tribe, I'm very proud to be a member of the tribe, so to speak. But I just mean to say that I think there's, it's kind of a semantic argument, which is perfectly good for what I see as written behind you. That whether or not, it's chicken and egg. Do I talk about this
I
topic
agree. I
because
agree.
I'm tribal about
We don't
it,
have to
or do
dilly
I know
dally on
about
it
the
too much.
topic because I was exposed to it from birth as a Jew, and as at the end of the day, I'm not sure it matters that much because above all else, my pursuit is of truth and justice in this area, rather than saying right or wrong, this is where I stand, because that's that.
Yeah, it's complicated. This particular conflict. It's hard to draw. Uh, it's hard to draw like clear right and wrong sometimes. I do think there are very clear right and wrongs in many instances, and then there's a mere principle of like who's winning, who's losing, who's got the better end of the stick.
Mhm.
It's a super complex argument, super complex conflict. I want to just shift over to the deal, right? Just to for our last point before we wrap up. Hopefully Israel's getting the 48 hostages back tomorrow in exchange for anywhere between 2 to 3,000 Palestinians, many of which committed or planned to commit horrific acts against Israelis. Now, I know for a certainty you're happy that the hostages are coming home. What do you think about this deal, and what do you think it means for the future between both sides?
The issue of hostage diplomacy is one I've written about a few times, including this week about this particular deal. I just literally before we spoke, I interviewed a friend of mine who I've spoken to before on my podcast and spoke to again this evening, called Tal Hartov. And Tal Hartov was the victim of a Palestinian terrorist attack some years back. She was stabbed 18 times as she was showing a friend as a tour guide around. Her friend was killed, a Christian woman. And they left Tal for dead, but Tal wasn't dead and managed to get herself up on her feet and walk away and seek help and eventually secure the imprisonment of her attacker, thanks to the fact that she stabbed him with her flick knife in self-defense and had a trace of his blood on that knife, which helped to secure the conviction. So
What a queen.
Tal's
What a queen. Wow. She
right,
took eight.
and a very, very powerful, very, very powerful person to listen to. So I recommend that. I mean, I literally just published it a few minutes before I jumped on here with you, which is why I was a little bit late. And the reason I spoke to her this evening, it was so important, was because one of her attackers is on the list for release. And so I said to Tal, as we were discussing this, are you against this? Because you've talked about the injustice of this guy that tried to kill you being released. And she said, I am completely in favor of the hostages being brought back, and I'm completely against murderers being let out of jail. And she said, and those two things coexist in my head. So I think many of us feel the same way without having to have been in the personal situation that Tal was in. And I also recognize that on a purely strategic level, giving back terrorists who've been convicted, tried in court, convicted, and put in jail in return for hostages has been shown over and over again to be damaging in the long term. And in the cost-benefit analysis, it always comes out wrong. Everyone knows that Yahya Sinwar was released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal. Gilad Shalit came back, but the guy that literally masterminded October the 7th was released back into Gaza. So I can't say that I'm against it. I want to see those people home. I just read Eli Sharabi's book that he wrote when he was released, and it's chilling and horrific to think of the conditions that the hostages have been in, and so many of them are dead. So many of them have been killed. So of course I'm in favor of it, but some really, really horrific people are being released, and it's very hard to know. I found it very difficult watching the celebrations over the last day or two in Israel. Actually, I find it really weird. I'm not sure what people are celebrating per se. I mean, they're celebrating the potential return of the hostages. Firstly, they're not back yet, and I'm not sure I'm going to even breathe a sigh of relief until they're back. I know there's so much that can change between now when we're talking and tomorrow
Yeah, they're
morning when we're
celebrating too soon. They're
right.
celebrating way.
And even when they're back,
Yeah,
these are people who are permanently ruined. I
yeah.
mean, I pray and I hope that they will build strong and meaningful and healthy and successful lives after this. But wow, there's something to celebrate in the redemption of hostages. We prayed for it. Even people who don't pray very much have prayed for that. And yet it's taken a very long time. And it's at a massively high cost. So I always say that Israel's choices are usually not between something great and something bad. They're usually between something bad and something dreadful. And in this case, I think, that is a prime example. There are no easy or good choices here. You can't leave people to that fate, and you can't release terrorists to go and carry out terrorism again. But that's what is happening, and it's completely understandable. I think it's a shame that the international community didn't put the right pressure from the start on actors like Qatar and Turkey and Iran to push for Hamas to release hostages earlier on. I think that it could have gone differently. I'm not one of these people that has this fantasy that it could all have been fixed on October the 8th or 9th. It couldn't. But I certainly think there's been a lot of toing and froing internationally, which hasn't helped as well. So I will be watching like everyone overnight and the early hours of tomorrow morning. I probably won't sleep a great deal. I will be enormously relieved if and when I see them coming home, and enormously sad and anxious about the horrible, horrible terrorists and murderers that are being released back into the wild, let's say. So I think it's a very, very difficult moment.
You made such a great point with having to choose between I guess you could say worse and terrible, or
Right.
bad and worse. It's terrible. What the reality is that from a strategic point of view, from a point of view of securing the country, this is a terrible decision. There's no way to put it. But we can act like these are people that should just be left to die. They have families who love them and are dying, literally
Yeah.
just broken from waiting to have them back. I can't imagine the unimaginable pain these family members are in, just praying every day that their kid. Yeah, yeah.
And I was just going to say, this is a great example of what we were talking about earlier. This is a Jewish value. So I do think that it is in line, at least with how I've been taught Judaism. The redemption of the hostages is a key and fundamental characteristic of Israel as a Jewish nation and of Jewish ethos, like saving of their lives, rescuing of those people is there is something that feels very fundamentally Jewish about it. I know that, for example, other countries haven't done similar things to rescue hostages. So I know that when Britain has had hostages, illegally arrested in the Islamic Republic of Iran, we have occasionally acted to have them released, paying ransom or whatever, but we often haven't as well. And in many other countries, there are actual citizens who are held hostage somewhere else in the world, and they're not household names. They're not prayed for week in, week out in places of worship or in the privacy of people's homes. Actually, there is something very peculiarly Israeli about this kind of deal. It's a deal that Israel has made over and over again since I think the Jibril deal, decades ago was possibly the first time it did this, and from then on, the currency gets worse and worse and worse. It fluctuates a bit, but it's hundreds or thousands in return for dozens or tens, and it does teach Israel's enemies that its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. And they know full well that Israel will make these deals and will continue to make these deals if they kidnap people. And that's why so many people were kidnapped on October the 7th, because they knew that Israel will make that deal and always will, I think.
No, it has to stop. You don't understand. I want to rip the hairs out of my head because Israel needs to stop being fucking stupid and avoiding these problems. And it means if it needs to be more brutal against its enemies to ensure that they don't get it's not, listen, I understand Israel doing these deals because I want the hostages back. Of course I do. But we can't continue to make these same mistakes again because we have to also consider the soldiers that are losing their lives and that are, God forbid, committing suicide. You got to consider all the people that were killed on October 7th. You got to consider, God forbid, the future hostages that are going to be taken and future people that are going to be stabbed and shot and God forbid, the R word, all these other things. We can't just say, oh, 48 hostages. What about the future Israelis, the children, the women, the soldiers?
Sure.
We keep going through this vicious cycle. When does it end? And
Yeah,
we're
well,
also have to consider we also have to consider the Gazas. 60, Hamas terrorists aside, think about the thousands of Gazans that were killed. You release Yahya Sinwar, maybe 70,000 people lost their lives as a result. So we saved Gilad Shalit, but 70,000 people died as a result. Not to
yeah.
mention people in other countries, Lebanese civilians, Syria, all these other the Druze, all these other things. These are all, you know, uh, tectonic plates. I don't know what analogy you want to use, but these are all ripple effects of things that, quite
And
frankly, we
none of,
we
none of that
we
is wrong.
are we have to make a decision, and if it means being disliked, we this is why we're putting Gaza back where it was. We're allowing some other are we crazy? Now you're seeing Hamas without their uniforms, just with AK-40s. They're not the same anymore. Now they're going and fighting these other groups, these other militias. What was that guy's name? Shabab or something, whatever his name is, that dude who was fighting against. It's like we're knowingly making the same mistake again and again, and it drives me nuts. And it's
Yeah,
like,
but
and
I
we're
guess
thinking,
this is back to what I was saying. I don't always think there's a better alternative. So there are
there
better
absolutely.
alternatives. There are often not perfect alternatives. So to my mind, that again, that's why I think people have been very harsh on Benjamin Netanyahu during this period, especially many of the kind of organized hostage families movement, which doesn't represent all of the hostage families, but does represent a groundswell of opinion, certainly in some respect. I would never have to like to make the decisions that Israeli leaders have to make in moments like this or any others. I'm eternally grateful that I don't have to make them. I don't know the answer. I don't think any of us does,
Well,
and that means that people, that because I don't think there is a right and a wrong answer. I think there are very strong and understandable arguments on, various sides of this, like the hostage debate, for example. For me, for you, it might feel obvious that, without any question, hostages must be saved. But it might also feel obvious that without any question, murderers must not be released to perpetrate
well,
again. And those two things cannot coexist at the same time in absolute form. So what I think that Netanyahu has done is at the end of it, he is saying, I will have got back all the hostages, some dead, some alive, some through ceasefires, very few through rescue, some got killed along the way. This is just the brutal truth of it all. Those who've said, well, ceasefire causes hostage release are obviously often ignoring the fact that you can only cease fire when you've had a war. So the truth is, military pressure has pushed towards ceasefire, which has pushed towards hostage release. I think it's all been horrible to watch from every quarter, and I don't know whether it was played exactly right or totally wrong or somewhere in between. I know it wasn't either. It was somewhere in between, and we'll argue, and historians will argue for centuries over, how it could have gone and what could have been done better. But ultimately, the people that make these decisions and that negotiate these arrangements don't have the benefit of, hindsight or historical comfort, or even it's very easy for people like me to do my job, to write about the decisions those people are making. It's much harder to make those decisions.
right, I hear you. I know what Trump would have done if thousands of Americans were kidnapped into Mexico. I can tell you that, and it would have been a lot less nice than what Israel has done. Now, again, I say that in my chair. I'm not a world leader. I'm not sitting here claiming that I would just, you have a lot of these people. If I were prime minister, if I were president, okay, pal. Okay, pal. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to sit here and make this claim that I would just easily have all the answers and I'd bring world peace. No, I don't say that, but what I do know for certainty, is that if Israel doesn't eventually, whether that's now or in 20 years or in 40 years, if we don't eventually claim sovereignty over Gaza and Judea and Samaria, we'll be in this cycle forever. Like we'll be in this cycle forever until maybe the Arabs actually defeat us. Like I'm telling, we can't keep making these stupid decisions. We don't have the luxury to constantly keep taking a shot at the fact that we'll always be stronger than our enemies. We're really just assuming. What if we don't have America's back eventually? What if we have a Nick Fuentes in the presidential seat? We keep assuming, oh yeah, we'll keep winning. I'm just we're and we keep putting our people again and again and again. What kind of quality of life is that? Over and over, we're releasing 2,000 convicted murderers back into Gaza like they're not going to do it again, and just the face palm I'm going to have when they kidnap more Israelis, God forbid. Like it's so aggravating. Like Trump has you could argue facilitated this hostage release, but he also didn't allow us to annex Gaza, which is the one thing I think we need to do. And once we get these hostages back, the IDF should go right back in, take Gaza over. That doesn't mean to expel everyone. If Gazans stay there, this is my idea. Have you heard of Mordechai Kedar, Doctor Kedar?
Yeah, yeah.
To have an Emirates plant. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm not saying it'll bring peace right away. But there has to be an idea where there's no Palestinian state. There will never be a Palestinian state. And I know that's not easy, but the reality is the whole concept of it is just to erase Israel. They're
Well,
not gonna.
I
Yeah.
spoke to, actually, I did an interview with Dr. Kedar as well, and there was, interestingly, because he's talked about that idea for years, and then it kind of gained a bit of traction when there was this story that Hebron might like to join the Abraham Accords on its own and kind of
Hmm.
disown the Palestinian Authority connection and what have you. I'm not actually sure where that's gone, if anywhere, since that story recently. But either way, I will say this about the current deal, which is, and I did write about this a couple of days ago in my column, which is I think the Trump plan is interesting. I mean, none of us really knows what's going on there and what's going on behind the scenes. But I do know that when you look at it, the only bit that really made any sense and that really looked real was the first 72 hours bit, which is what we're living through now. The idea of Israeli troop withdrawal, ceasefire, and hostage release. Beyond that, most of the 21, I think it was, points are fantasy. I think everyone knows they won't happen, and nobody quite knows what happens when they don't happen. So, as I saw it, the most important part was in the Trump calculation, and therefore in also Netanyahu's, was getting back all of the remaining hostages, dead or alive. That seemed to be the bottom line, and Netanyahu's bottom line seemed to be to do that without total withdrawal from Gaza of troops, which appears to be what's happening with this yellow line. Though I did see some reports today that the IDF has withdrawn from areas that aren't demanded in the agreement. I don't know if that's right or not. Beyond that, I have no idea how much of this kind of fantasy storybook 21-point plan will happen, or how much any of the players expect it to happen. But it seems to have worked to unstick that initial congestion of this not really progressing in terms of the hostages. So that's another reason why I'm sort of I'm waiting this one out a bit. Like, before I have anything too strong to say about the plan, its long-term future, Tony Blair being like the governor of Gaza, or the Peace Corps, or whatever they're called, and the international troops, and all these things that we know don't work anywhere else. UNIFIL didn't work in Lebanon, and we're not going to see some equivalent work then. And the UN is going to distribute aid after 2 years, when the whole world finally understood that it wasn't doing such a good job. And all of those elements, I think Donald Trump knows they're not real. I think most of the Arab states that signed on know they're not real. But I think it kind of ticked everyone's boxes. And even this, Sharm el Sheikh 20 nations meeting to discuss the next steps, it will all be very interesting. But I'm not sure Donald Trump's big set piece events always result in actions. We saw that with Putin. We saw it when he met the North Korean leader. We've seen it with other times where he has these massive kind of presentation events. I don't think they're always intended to follow through into action. I think if they do, it will be great, and if they don't, something else happens. But I think that Trump has predominantly seen himself as an unblocker, as a forward motion person. So that's what I wrote in the column, was I think that his aim here was just to get forward motion, not to get perfection or utopia or Palestinian statehood or a reformed Palestinian authority, or even maybe not even to get a totally demilitarized Gaza or totally defeated Hamas, but to get somewhere down that list that was written. And the first step of that was getting back the hostages, which he has prioritized enormously. And I think Israel is right behind that. What happens after that? I mean, we could meet again in a few days or weeks and see just how much of the 21 points we get through. But I don't think it will be that many.
Totally fair. I agree. There are going to be a lot of hiccups along the way, and it's not going to stick long term. I'll tell you, if Israel doesn't annex Gaza, which it doesn't look like it will do now, we're just going to have more attacks in the near future. Secondly, Trump, in his mind, in my opinion, does not see the conflict being solved during his term, or any time after. So he probably just wants this ceasefire deal so he can get the hostages back, so he can feel like he brought on this temporary peace. He looks great. Maybe he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, c'est la vie. And his mind is like, well, they weren't going to fix that anyway. That thing's not getting solved for a while. Let's just put a band-aid on it, like we can, like we've been doing since forever. And that's enough for me. I go home. I'm happy. Let the next president take on the ensuing issues. That's
Well,
what I
to some
think.
extent, isn't that what we're all doing in our lives? We're trying to get through to the other end and make things at least a bit better. Like that's the point. I'm not sure there is a kind of utopic end point of this conflict, and I think that, of course, I'm not trying to shrug off, getting it right, but I do think that sometimes that approach. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it how you have, but I think it's a perfectly valid interpretation. And I think sometimes that could be better than some alternatives. That's all. I don't really know. As I said, the benefit of being a commentator rather than a leader and strategist
Mm.
myself is that I definitely don't think I have all the answers, but I do often have something interesting to say about other people's attempts. So, um,
Right.
yeah,
Totally fair. Totally fair. Totally fair. Being that I served in the IDF,
yeah.
I was in the West Bank. I do have my thoughts, and
No, and from
yeah,
that you have more direct on the ground experience than I do, certainly, and I think that's worth an awful lot as well.
right. So that's why, if I didn't, if I didn't have that experience, then maybe I wouldn't be so confident in what I'm saying. And I don't think we'll ever have any sort of utopia anywhere. I don't think we'll ever be in a world where there's no fighting or no violence whatsoever. But I think we can repair a lot of it if we
Who's
are.
going to tell John Lennon?
That's great. That's a great way to end the talk, man. That's great. Okay, is there anything else? Because I do have to be somewhere at 7, so
No, that's all
uh,
good.
yeah,
It's been fun. It's been a really interesting conversation. So thank you, Rafi, and great to get to know you a bit more like this.
for sure. Thank you so much for giving me all this time, Jonathan. Really, I appreciate it immensely. We were here for 2 hours. I wasn't expecting it to go that long, and I learned a lot from you, and I appreciate your you know intellectualizing of deep topics. Uh, Really, Jonathan, it was awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Keep well.
Okay, for sure. So I'm just going to quickly shut this out. So, ladies and gents, thank you for making it to the end of this episode of the Soothing Semantics podcast with my guest, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Make sure to check out his work. You do have a Substack
I have a
for your
Substack,
articles?
johnsack.substack.com, and I'm everywhere else as well. So if you look at jonathansacerdoti.com, you'll find links to everything.
Fantastic. Of course, follow me, Rafi the Realtor. Give this channel a sub if you haven't yet. Make sure to smash the like button, leave your comments, and I will hopefully see you on the next episode. Peace.